Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today we're doing the next in our series of comparison videos between New Jersey and other classes of battleship. Today's comparison is going to be with the South Dakota Class battleship. These are American vessels which were completed about a year before the Iowas. They're the class which immediately preceded New Jersey. There were 4 South Dakota Class battleships: South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts, and Alabama. Massachusetts is still a museum ship located in Fall River, Massachusetts, and Alabama survived as a museum ship in Mobile, Alabama. So if you ever get the chance to visit one of those ships, be sure to. Whereas the Iowas served up into the 1990s and have a lot of contemporary features on board, Massachusetts and Alabama retained many of their World War II features. Additionally, whereas the Iowas were only turned into museums in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Massachusetts and Alabama have been museums since the 1960s, and their staffs have spent the last 50 or 60 years collecting parts, restoring their ships, opening spaces. So visiting either one of them is a great tour, and I'd highly recommend it. We're standing at the bow of New Jersey because this is the biggest difference between these two ships. They look very identical in the superstructure. They have very similar main battery armaments. Their armor is almost identical. In fact, the South Dakota was the starting place for the Iowa design process. The Iowas got an extra 10,000 tons of displacement thanks to the escalator clause of the Second London Naval Treaty, and the U.S. Navy chose to use that extra displacement to make these ships faster. So for those 10,000 tons, they basically repeated the South Dakota class, but added 6 more knots of speed. To achieve this, they had to stretch the design out longer. So both battleships are 108 feet wide, but the Iowas are almost 200 feet longer. Because they're longer, they have to have a longer armored belt to defend all the extra engineering spaces that were added. And they also got a much longer nose on the bow of the ship that gives them a better length to beam ratio. Behind me are the forward 16-inch 50 caliber guns of Battleship New Jersey. South Dakota class battleships had a similar armament in that they had 9 barrels in 3 triple turrets, but instead of the 16-inch 50 caliber guns of the Iowa class, they still had the older 45 caliber guns. What does that mean? Caliber is telling you the length of the barrel as a measurement of the diameter. So a 16-inch 50 caliber gun means that the barrel is 16 inches wide and then 50 times 16 inches long. And in theory, higher caliber means you're going to get higher velocity and higher range because there's more rifling in there. It's spinning the shell more before it spits it out. So theoretically, those 5 extra calibers give the Iowa class battleship a couple thousand yards extra range, and it gives them a flatter trajectory, which again theoretically makes it easier to aim these guns at long range. However, because South Dakota class battleships have a steeper trajectory, their guns are better at plunging fire. They go up to a higher arc and then drop down. Instead of hitting the thickly armored side of an enemy ship, they're hitting the much less armored deck at a steeper angle. So that would theoretically do more damage to an enemy warship. The South Dakotas fired on enemy warships on at least 2 occasions. Off Guadalcanal, South Dakota herself fired on Japanese warships, but it was dark and at point-blank range. But off Casablanca, in 1942, when Massachusetts was firing on the incomplete French battleship Jean Bart, she was dropping 16-inch shells on the deck of the French ship, and she was able to do a tremendous amount of damage to that vessel. Since South Dakota class battleships are American like New Jersey, and the class immediately preceding the Iowas they have a very similar anti-aircraft armament. Because they are smaller vessels, they didn't carry quite as many guns, however. While the Iowa-class battleships were built from the start incorporating the 40mm gun behind me, the South Dakotas had them added on about a year into their service. So they were initially built with the 1.1-inch Chicago piano type quadruple anti-aircraft gun. This was an American design that was less than 100% effective. They said the gun crews kept a ball-peen hammer on hand for if the gun jammed. The very excellent Bofors Quad 40 worked much better, and those were retrofitted to these ships by late 42, early 1943. Also behind me is the ship's 5-inch gun battery. The South Dakotas had the same 10 twin 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns as Iowa-class battleships, with the exception of South Dakota herself, since she was fitted out as a fleet flagship and had extra weight added by an extra level of armored conning tower. 2 of the 5-inch gun mounts were removed, so 4 total barrels out of her 20 were lost. The other ships had the same battery. Their guns were just clustered closer together because she had a smaller superstructure area. These ships also carried 20mm Oerlikons, again in smaller numbers than the Iowas had. They started out with more when they had less 40mm, and then 40mm eventually replaced a fair number of them. Fire control was the same for these guns, was the very excellent American fire control systems, the Mark 37s for the 5-inch guns and the Mark 51s for the 40mm, and these guns were extremely effective. Comparing this ship's anti-aircraft battery to almost any other ship in the world, she would come out on top, with the exception of comparing her to the Iowas, which had the same but slightly more batteries. So New Jersey has better anti-aircraft guns only because she could fit more and because she had better fields of fire with less cramped conditions. The largest difference between South Dakota class battleships and Iowa class battleships like New Jersey is in the engineering spaces. Not only do the Iowas have a better power plant designed to move them at 33 knots as opposed to South Dakota's 27 knots, they also have that power plant subdivided more. On a South Dakota class battleship, there are 4 engineering main spaces. Each one has a set of turbines that are attached to the propeller and the boilers that provide steam to those turbines, as well as the turbo generators that provide electricity, etc., etc. On an Iowa-class battleship, the fire rooms with the boilers and the engine rooms with the turbines are separated by bulkheads. Theoretically, even though this is more complex and heavier, it does make the Iowa-class battleships more survivable. And their ability to cross-connect allows for battle damage to be negated. If a boiler is knocked out, you can reroute steam from another fire room to that boiler room's engines and continue to run on all 4 turbines. South Dakotas do have the ability to subdivide, but because they've got all of their stuff in one room, if that one room floods, then you lose more than you do on an Iowa-class ship. We're sitting here at the Armored Conning Tower for Battleship New Jersey. This is the single thickest piece of armor on the ship. It's about 17.3 inches thick. Iowa-class battleships and South Dakota-class battleships had virtually identical armor systems. Their torpedo defense, belt armor, deck armor, turret protection, secondary battery protection was all more or less identical. Both ships featured an angled armored belt, which increased its relative thickness. However, this internal angled belt wasn't what the Navy wanted. It was more of what they were saddled with because of the weight limitations of the international naval treaties. It was the only way they could devise a belt that had any sort of immunity zone against 16-inch projectiles. The reason they didn't like the internal angled belt, with the angled belt, it gave less protection at seams, like where the bottom connected. So there was some fear that against torpedoes, that seam would be blown open. In either case, neither ship was ever severely threatened by torpedo damage, and they were worried that if the ship ever took significant battle damage with an internal belt, it would be much more difficult to repair than an external belt. As it turned out, the Iowa-class battleships were never severely damaged by enemy gunfire or bomb hits or anything like that either. South Dakota herself was probably the only member of the class that took significant damage. That was during some of the naval fighting around Guadalcanal. She was damaged heavily by 14-inch, 8-inch, and smaller shell fire from Japanese cruisers and battleships. While this damage perforated the superstructure and led to some power outages, the ship's reserve of buoyancy and ability to sail was never threatened, though it did knock her out of combat for a brief period of time. The same would have likely happened to an Iowa-class battleship in a similar situation, as their armor was so similar. Another major difference between South Dakota and Iowa-class battleships are what are known as the Skaggs. Now, on a typical battleship, here's a 1/700 scale model of Arizona, each propeller shaft has a full run outside of the hull. On Iowa and South Dakota battleships, two of the propellers are attached to Skaggs. These Skaggs are more rigid and more protected than just having a loose propeller shaft out there. And they help channel water around the hull, and it's probably one of the contributing factors to why Iowa-class battleships are so maneuverable. Another one is that they have two rudders, as opposed to many other battleships having a single rudder. South Dakota and Iowa-class battleships have different Skaggs, though. The Iowas have their Skaggs on the inboard screws. South Dakotas have their Skaggs along the outboard screws. Many battleships were damaged or disabled because a single torpedo or hit was able to hit a rudder or propellers. The theory with the South Dakotas were, one, that Skagg is going to provide support to these ships in dry dock, and two, it will help defend the interior rudders and propellers from blast damage so that the ship could still maneuver and move to some degree. Unlike battleships like Bismarck and Prince of Wales, which were both disabled by hits at their stern. In reality, South Dakota ships suffered from severe vibrations throughout their career, especially when operating at high speed. This was probably due to the water flow going between the Skaggs. The Navy tried a number of things to fix this. For example, Massachusetts has 5-bladed outer propellers and 3-bladed inner propellers of different sizes. And other South Dakota battleships got different configurations throughout their careers, all to attempt to fix this problem. Had those ships been built in peacetime, they would have been able to have an extended shakedown period to sort that out. In actuality, those ships saw almost all of their service in wartime, and it was never fully fixed. That vibration problem was not only an issue with South Dakotas, though. As all of the American battleships reached high speed, they suffered vibration problems. At full speed, the Iowas vibrated terribly aft of turret 3. And the earlier North Carolina-class battleships that were built directly before the South Dakotas suffered severe vibration problems that required their after fire control directors to be braced before they could go into combat. Another difference between these ships is their sizes. As we've already said, Iowas are much longer. They had to have specially reinforced slipways built in Navy yards in order for them to be built and launched. The South Dakotas, because they were so much smaller and 10,000 tons lighter, were able to be built in private yards, with South Dakota herself being built practically where the Battleship New Jersey is moored today. Battleship X was built right here in Camden at New York Shipbuilding Company. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, check out the comment section down below. We try to get back to you as quickly as possible. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and click the bell icon so that you get notifications when we are posting new videos. And if you would like to support the museum, the channel, and the work we're doing, check the description down below. There's a link if you'd like to help out.